Bavaria sprawled beneath grey April skies in 1945, and the rumbling started low, almost like distant thunder rolling across farmland, except this thunder came from tank treads chewing through muddy roads. Inside the wooden barracks that had served as their prison for years, Greta Weber felt the vibration climb through the floorboards and into her bones. She shifted her weight without thinking, moving sideways until her body created a barrier between the approaching sounds and the two younger women who sat frozen on their thin mattresses. 23 years old, and Greta had spent the last 4 of those years learning one fundamental truth. When danger approached, you placed yourself in its path first. You became the shield. You made yourself visible so the others might go unnoticed just a little longer. The younger one, Liesel, couldn't stop her hands from trembling. 19 now, she'd been just 16 when they'd collected her from the Hamburg orphanage with promises of factory work and hot meals. Her fingers worked constantly at the fabric of her dress, twisting and smoothing, until the grey cotton bore permanent marks from her nervous habit. She whispered something about Americans, her voice barely carrying across the small space, nearly drowned by the mechanical growling that grew louder with each passing second. Ingrid sat like a statue on her cot, spine straight as a ruler, maintaining the posture of the schoolteacher she'd once been before her whole world collapsed. 28 years old, and she still couldn't shake the habits of her former profession, that rigid composure, that need to appear calm even when terror clawed at your throat. She observed the dust clouds visible through their single grimy window and stated the obvious with clinical detachment. The Wehrmacht had abandoned them before sunrise, retreating and leaving everything behind, including the women they'd kept locked in these barracks for years. The silence that fell over the 3 of them carried weight. They breathed shallow and quick, listening as the mechanical thunder grew closer, watching through dirty glass as clouds of disturbed earth rose against the pale morning light. Greta had occupied this room since 1941, since soldiers arrived at her village when she was just 19 and announced she was needed for essential war service. The lie had arrived wrapped in official papers and authoritative voices. Her mother had actually believed them, had packed Greta's small bag with her best dress and tucked her grandmother's prayer book inside as protection. That prayer book had disappeared in the winter of 1943, traded for bread during a week when hunger felt more dangerous than any loss of faith. But Greta still carried every prayer in her memory, even though she hadn't spoken them aloud in longer than she could remember. The mechanical roaring reached its peak and then cut off abruptly. The sudden absence of sound felt almost worse than the noise. Into that silence came voices, male voices shouting in English, sharp commands in a language she didn't fully understand but recognized instantly as the sound of soldiers claiming territory. She'd heard German officers issue similar orders countless times, that particular tone men used when taking possession of space, of resources, of whatever they found. Greta whispered instructions to stay behind her, though she understood the futility of the words even as they left her mouth. No back door existed in these barracks, no escape route, no place to run. They'd learned years ago to stop looking for exits. Escape wasn't something women like them were permitted to contemplate. Heavy boots crunched across gravel outside, multiple pairs moving with military precision, growing closer. Greta's body responded automatically, assuming the position that had kept her breathing through 4 years of hell. Shoulders pulled back but not defiant, eyes lowered but not closed, hands loose at her sides in a careful balance between available and resistant, compliant but not quite broken. Finding that exact balance had taken her months of painful trial and error. Liesel made a small wounded sound and pressed herself flat against the far wall. Fear lived too close to her surface. She'd never mastered the art of hiding terror the way older women learned to do. Her fear showed in every line of her body, honest and raw and vulnerable. Ingrid murmured something about breathing, her teacher's instinct to soothe and instruct still functioning despite everything they'd endured. The boots stopped directly outside their door. English words filtered through the thin wood, then another male voice responding. Greta caught the word secure and understood enough to know they were discussing the building's contents, cataloguing inventory. She'd become fluent in the language of being counted and classified. The door handle turned with a long squeal of metal that needed oil. Greta straightened her spine and raised her chin just enough to be seen clearly. She'd learned early that being discovered hiding made men assume you possessed something worth punishing. Better to be visible immediately, to present yourself clearly before they started searching. Sunlight poured through the opening door, creating a silhouette of a tall figure in American uniform. Behind him, she glimpsed more soldiers, younger men with clean-shaven faces and crisp khaki that smelled like soap and starch instead of sweat and old tobacco. The officer in the doorway paused, his gaze moving from Greta to Liesel to Ingrid. Something flickered across his features that Greta hadn't seen in a man's face since before the war started. Something that looked like shock giving way to recognition, giving way to something else entirely. Something that resembled pity if such a thing could still exist in the world. He spoke quietly to the soldiers behind him, then stepped backward without crossing their threshold. His German came out careful and accented when he spoke. They weren't going to hurt anyone, and the women were safe now. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to believe, yet somehow impossible to completely dismiss. Greta felt something shift in her chest, a tiny crack appearing in the wall she'd built around her expectations. She'd learned over 4 years not to trust promises from uniformed men, but this particular man hadn't even entered their space. He'd offered words from the doorway and then retreated. The truck bed where they sat had been lined with clean canvas that didn't reek of diesel fuel or unwashed bodies. Greta positioned herself between Liesel and Ingrid, their shoulders touching, maintaining the formation they'd held through countless transports over the years. But this time felt different. No one had separated them. No one had pointed at Liesel and dragged her toward a different vehicle, or shoved Ingrid toward the officer's transport. They remained together. That small mercy felt so unexpected that Greta struggled to process it, struggled to understand what it might mean. The American soldier driving their truck had helped them climb up without unnecessary touching. He'd simply extended his hand palm upward, waiting for each woman to decide whether to accept the offered assistance. When Liesel flinched away from the gesture, he'd quietly placed a wooden crate beside the tailgate for her to use as a step instead, then moved away to give her space. Through the canvas opening at the back, Greta watched Bavarian countryside roll past, fields marked by tank treads and abandoned military equipment, but still showing green spring growth pushing through the damage. Everyone said the war was ending. She'd heard it whispered among the guards in their final days, seen it in the way Wehrmacht officers had burned documents and fled before dawn arrived. But endings had never meant freedom for women in their position. Endings just meant new beginnings under different masters wearing different uniforms. Camp Lucky Strike spread across a hillside like a temporary city constructed with military precision. Row after row of canvas tents and wooden buildings stretched in neat lines, all surrounded by wire fences that looked disturbingly familiar. Greta felt her stomach clench as they approached the main gate. The guards wore different uniforms and spoke different words, but gates were gates and fences were fences, and she'd learned what fences meant. The trucks stopped in front of a low wooden structure marked with a red cross symbol. The same soldier who'd driven them opened the tailgate and stepped back, creating space for them to climb down on their own terms. Greta noticed how he kept his hands visible at all times, how he announced each movement before making it. These weren't the behaviours of men who took whatever they wanted without asking permission. A tall sergeant emerged from the building, his uniform crisp despite the late afternoon heat settling over the camp. His face showed weathering but also kindness, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned. He spoke to the driver in English first, then approached the 3 women with measured, careful steps, the kind of approach you'd use with frightened animals. His German carried a heavy accent, but came out clear enough to understand. His name was Sergeant Morrison, and they would be staying in Building 7, which was clean and secure. No one would enter without their permission. Liesl made a small sound of disbelief that she quickly stifled. Permission? The word felt foreign in her mouth, almost meaningless. They hadn't been asked permission for anything in so long that Greta had forgotten what it felt like to have choices that actually mattered, to have someone wait for her answer before acting. Morrison led them across the compound, past rows of tents where American soldiers looked up from whatever evening activities occupied them. Some stared with curious eyes, others with expressions Greta couldn't quite read. But none of them called out crude suggestions or made the gestures she'd learned to expect from soldiers with free time. They simply looked and then returned to their card games and letter writing. Building 7 turned out to be a converted barracks with 6 cots arranged along the walls, each one equipped with a folded blanket and a small wooden crate serving as a bedside table. The blankets were wool, thick and clean, with the kind of softness that spoke of proper washing and genuine care. Greta ran her fingers along the edge of one and felt something loosen in her chest at the simple luxury of fabric that didn't smell like fear and suffering. Morrison pulled a sheet of paper from his jacket pocket and tacked it to the wall beside the door. The German text had been written in careful black letters, formal and clear. Rule number 1 stated that no prisoner would be sexually assaulted or harmed. Rule number 2 said no soldier could enter this building without permission from the occupants. Rule number 3 explained that meals would be delivered at specific hours, and they were not required to earn them. Ingrid stared at the posted rules with the intensity of someone trying to decode a message in a foreign language. She started to say something, then stopped, as if the words she needed didn't exist in any language she knew. A young guard appeared in the doorway carrying a metal pot and 3 bowls. He looked barely older than Liesl, with the soft face of someone who'd probably been working on his family's farm a year ago before being drafted. He set the pot on the floor just inside the door and immediately stepped back. His broken German announced that the pot contained soup, hot soup for eating. When he reached toward Liesl to hand her a bowl directly, she flinched so violently that she stumbled backward and fell onto one of the cots. The young guard froze, his face draining of colour with horror at having frightened her. Morrison appeared beside him instantly. He spoke to the guard in English, using the name Johnson, then switched to German to explain that they announced themselves, kept distance, and let the women come to them. The guard, this Johnson, nodded rapidly and set the bowls on the floor beside the pot. His whispered apology came out in broken German, repeating that he meant no hurt at all. After they left, the 3 women sat in silence, staring at the steaming pot of soup. It smelled of vegetables and meat, rich and nourishing in a way they'd almost forgotten food could be. But more than the food itself, what struck them was that it had been given freely, without demands or expectations attached. Greta reached for a bowl with trembling fingers, half expecting someone to appear and name the price she would have to pay for this kindness. No one came. Outside their window, she could hear American soldiers calling to each other in the gathering dusk, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of men who slept safely at night. For the first time in 4 years, Greta allowed herself to wonder if she might sleep safely too. By the 3rd day, the routine had begun to feel like a small miracle they didn't quite deserve. Breakfast arrived at 8 o'clock precisely, delivered by the young soldier Johnson, who had learned to knock twice, announce himself clearly, and wait for permission before entering their space. He set the tray just inside the door with careful reverence, as if he understood he was handling something more fragile than dishes and food. Greta found herself waking before the knock each morning, her body still programmed for hypervigilance, but no longer braced for immediate threat. She would lie on her cot listening to Liesl's soft breathing and Ingrid's precisely controlled sleep, marvelling at the absence of heavy boots in the hallway, the lack of crude voices demanding entrance. The silence felt almost too good to trust, too fragile to last. The infection in her shoulder had been festering for weeks, a souvenir from a particularly brutal Wehrmacht officer who'd enjoyed leaving marks that would last. She'd hidden it well, knowing that visible wounds often made men either more violent or more disgusted, neither of which improved her chances of survival. But on the fourth morning, when she couldn't lift her right arm without wincing, Liesel noticed the way she favoured her left side. The observation came quietly. Greta was hurt. The shoulder, yes. Before Greta could deflect or minimise, Ingrid was beside her with the efficient assessment of someone who'd spent years caring for others. That needed medical attention, she said with quiet authority, her teacher's voice brooking no argument. It was infected. The idea of voluntarily asking for help from American soldiers felt impossible. Help had always come with a price tag attached, and medical attention from men had never been about healing. But as the morning wore on and the throbbing in her shoulder worsened, Greta found herself considering the unthinkable. When Johnson arrived with lunch, Ingrid stepped forward with the careful dignity that made her seem taller than her actual height. She excused herself in her precise German, then attempted the English phrase she'd been practicing. "Medical help, please?" Johnson's boyish face immediately creased with concern. He set down the food tray and hurried away, returning minutes later with a compact Asian-American soldier who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to emergencies. The medic introduced himself as Corporal Chen, speaking German that was significantly better than Morrison's heavy accent. He understood someone needed medical attention. When Greta reluctantly indicated her shoulder, Chen nodded and opened his medical bag on the small table. But instead of immediately reaching for her, he began pulling out supplies and explaining each item as he set it down. "Antiseptic solution for cleaning," he said, showing her a brown bottle. "Clean bandages, antibiotic powder." He paused to explain that the cleaning process might sting but would help prevent further infection. Then he paused again and looked directly at her. He needed to examine the injury to treat it properly. Was that acceptable to her? The question hung in the air like something unprecedented, revolutionary. Acceptable to her, as if her acceptance mattered, as if she had the right to say no to a man who wanted to touch her body. Greta whispered yes, then cleared her throat and said it again more firmly, testing the sound of consent given freely. Chen's examination was clinical and gentle, his hands careful and his voice steady as he explained each step. The infection was localized but significant. He would need to clean it thoroughly and apply antibiotics. She should keep it dry and covered for several days. As he worked, cleaning the wound with methodical precision, Greta found herself studying his face. There was no hunger in his expression, no calculation about what this medical attention might entitle him to later. He simply tended to her injury with the same focused care she imagined he would give to any wounded soldier under his care. When he finished securing the clean bandage with medical tape, he packed up his supplies and stood, but made no move to leave immediately. The human body had remarkable healing capacity when given proper care and safety, he said quietly, and both were available to her here. After he left, the three women sat in stunned silence. Finally, Liesel spoke with something that might have been wonder in her voice. He'd asked permission before touching Greta. Ingrid added that he'd explained everything, every step, every supply, every reason. Her teacher's mind was cataloguing the unprecedented experience, filing it away as evidence that perhaps the world contained more than cruelty. That evening, when Morrison made his routine check, Ingrid surprised herself by stepping forward. She asked about the Red Cross, whether they carried letters to find family. Morrison's weathered face softened. Yes, they did. Did she have family she'd like to locate? Ingrid spoke about her sons, and the words seemed to unlock something that had been held tightly closed for years. Twin boys. They would be 11 now. They'd been placed in American custody when she was, and she couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't speak the words that described what had happened to her. Morrison promised to get her the paperwork tomorrow. The Red Cross had been very effective at reuniting families. That night, for the first time since they'd arrived at the camp, the three women talked about something other than survival. Liesl mentioned that she'd once wanted to be a teacher, like Ingrid. Greta spoke haltingly about her mother's garden, how the roses climbed the cottage walls each summer, how the scent of them filled the house in June. Ingrid described her son's laughter, the way they'd run to greet her each day after school, their small hands grabbing at her skirt. Their voices grew stronger as they spoke, losing the whispered quality that had become second nature over years of forced silence. Outside their window, the American camp settled into its evening routine, the sounds of safety and normalcy drifting through the spring air like a promise. For the first time in years, tomorrow felt like something to anticipate rather than simply endure. The film reel arrived on a grey morning when the spring air carried more chill than warmth, when clouds hung low and heavy over the camp. Greta noticed the change in the camp's atmosphere before she understood its source. Conversation stopped abruptly when soldiers passed their building, and the easy laughter that had become familiar background noise grew sparse and strained, replaced by tense silence. Morrison appeared at their door just after breakfast, his usually steady demeanour replaced by something heavier, something that weighed on his shoulders like a physical burden. Behind him stood a soldier Greta hadn't seen before, a compact man with hard eyes and shoulders that seemed to carry invisible weight. Morrison introduced him as Corporal Sullivan, explaining he'd be working with their unit for the next few weeks. Sullivan's gaze swept over the three women with an expression Greta recognised from years of reading men's faces for signs of danger. It wasn't the clinical assessment of the medic Chen, or the gentle concern of young Johnson. This was evaluation, judgment, the look of someone trying to determine guilt or innocence through visual inspection alone. He nodded stiffly toward Ingrid as the eldest, calling her Mom, but his voice carried an undertone that made Liesl unconsciously step closer to Greta's protective presence. After they left, an uncomfortable silence settled over Building 7. The easy routine they'd begun to trust felt suddenly fragile, as if a single suspicious look could shatter the safety they'd barely begun to accept. The change became more pronounced over the following days. Guards who'd grown accustomed to casual conversation now maintained professional distance. Johnson still delivered their meals with careful courtesy, but his boyish smile seemed forced, and he avoided meeting their eyes directly. The shift in atmosphere felt like weather changing before a storm, that electric tension in the air when something terrible approached. Corporal Chen finally explained what was happening when he arrived to check Greta's healing shoulder with his usual medical bag. His typically calm demeanour seemed strained, his movements less fluid than usual. There had been new information about the concentration camps, he said quietly as he examined her wound. Film footage, documentation. The soldiers were processing what they'd seen, trying to make sense of horror that defied comprehension. Greta felt her chest tighten. They'd heard whispers about the camps over the years, terrible rumours that seemed too horrific to believe, too monstrous to be real. But whispers and documented reality were different things entirely. Chen continued speaking as he applied fresh bandages with gentle precision. Some of the men were struggling to understand the difference between victims and perpetrators. It was difficult for them to process that German women could suffer under the same system that had committed such atrocities. The system didn't differentiate in their minds, and anger was easier than nuance. That afternoon, Sullivan appeared at their door again, but this time without Morrison's moderating presence. He carried a manila folder and wore the expression of someone fulfilling an unpleasant duty, someone who'd rather be anywhere else but felt compelled to follow through. He announced in heavily accented German that he needed to ask questions, his tone suggesting the questions were more like accusations waiting to be confirmed. Ingrid straightened to her full height, assuming the authoritative posture that had once commanded classrooms full of children. "What kind of questions?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear Greta could see in her eyes. Sullivan opened the folder and pulled out several photographs, grainy black and white images that made Liesl gasp and turn away, unable to look. The images showed emaciated figures behind barbed wire, mass graves, children with hollow eyes staring at the camera with expressions that would haunt anyone who saw them. Sullivan asked what they'd known, what they'd seen. The photographs lay between them like accusations made manifest. Greta stared at the evidence of systematic murder and felt something collapse inside her chest. Not surprise exactly, but a terrible confirmation of humanity's capacity for evil. She'd known evil intimately, had lived with it pressed against her skin for 4 years. But seeing it documented, made official, made real in photographs, somehow made her own survival feel like complicity, like she'd been part of the system simply by continuing to breathe. Greta whispered that they'd known they were nothing, that they'd known they didn't matter. Her voice barely carried across the small space. Sullivan pressed, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. That wasn't an answer. These camps had been all over the country. People had to know. People had to see what was happening. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Liesl began to shake, her fragile stability crumbling under the weight of Sullivan's words. They'd told the women they were lucky, she said through tears streaming down her face. They'd said the women could have been sent to work camps instead. The women had thought, they'd thought that meant factory work, regular labour. Ingrid's teacher instincts kicked in even as her own composure threatened to break. They'd been told they were serving the Reich, she said with bitter precision. They'd been told their sacrifice kept worse things from happening to other women. They'd believed they were the price paid to protect others, that their suffering had purpose. Sullivan stared at them with disgust that felt like a physical blow, like being struck across the face. How did he know they weren't just as guilty as everyone else? The question hung in the air like a verdict already delivered. Greta felt years of carefully constructed survival crumble around her. The shame she'd fought so hard to contain came flooding back, mixed now with the terrible knowledge that while they'd been trapped in their own hell, others had suffered and died in ways that made their own torture seem almost merciful by comparison. Greta heard herself say that maybe they were guilty, maybe surviving made them complicit, maybe they should have died instead. The words scraped her throat raw. Sullivan gathered up the photographs and stood, leaving them with their shame and the horrible certainty that their brief taste of dignity had been a cruel illusion. They huddled together on the cots as darkness fell, no longer 3 women healing, but 3 conspirators in history's greatest crime, marked by their survival as surely as if guilt had been tattooed on their foreheads. Outside their window, the American camp continued its evening routines, but now those sounds felt distant and condemning, as if even the spring air carried judgment against them. The silence in Building 7 had weight now, pressing down on them like a physical thing they could feel against their skin. For 3 days after Sullivan's interrogation, the women barely spoke, moving through their routines like ghosts haunting their own lives. They accepted their meals with downcast eyes and whispered thanks, waiting for the inevitable moment when someone would realize the truth about what they were and take away even these small mercies they'd been granted. Greta found herself cataloguing every kindness she'd received since arriving at Camp Lucky Strike, preparing to surrender each one as payment for the crime of surviving when others had not. The clean blankets, the gentle medical care, the simple dignity of being asked for permission, all of it felt stolen now, luxuries she had no right to claim. Liesl had retreated into the manic silence that had once been her primary defense mechanism, rocking slightly on her cot and staring at the wall with unseeing eyes that focused on nothing. Ingrid sat rigid and watchful, her teacher's mind working frantically to find some logical framework that could make sense of guilt and innocence in a world where both had become meaningless concepts, where the categories themselves seemed to have dissolved. When Morrison appeared in their doorway on the 4th morning, flanked by Sullivan and carrying an official-looking document, Greta felt her heart sink toward her stomach. This was the moment she'd been expecting, the reckoning, the official judgment that would strip away their temporary sanctuary and confirm what Sullivan's photographs had already proven. That German women who had survived the war were inherently suspect, complicit by virtue of breathing while others died. But instead of reading charges or demanding confessions, Morrison stepped forward with the same careful gentleness he'd shown since their first day at the camp. Sullivan stood behind him, his face a mask of conflicted emotions that seemed to war with each other in real time, shame and anger, and something else fighting for dominance. Morrison spoke quietly, his weathered hands steady on the document he carried. What happened in those camps, that wasn't on them. What happened to them, that wasn't on them either. The words seemed to come from some impossible place where logic and mercy intersected, where justice didn't require victims to shoulder the guilt of their tormentors. Greta felt them hit her chest like physical blows, each syllable challenging the guilt she'd wrapped around herself like armor. Morrison turned slightly to include Sullivan in his gaze, making sure the younger soldier heard what he said next. These women had survived hell. They weren't the enemy. They were the evidence of what the Allies had been fighting against all along. Sullivan's face crumpled slightly, as if some internal dam had finally given way under too much pressure. He looked at Greta with eyes that seemed to see her clearly for the first time, not as a representative of German guilt, but as a young woman whose childhood had been stolen and whose innocence had been weaponized against her. Sullivan asked in halting German, his voice stripped of the accusations that had defined their previous interactions. How old had she been when they took her? Greta whispered that she'd been 19, the number feeling both ancient and impossibly young simultaneously. Sullivan closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. He breathed something in English that sounded like a curse or a prayer, then struggled with the German words. His sister was 19 now, at home in Ohio. He extended his hand toward Greta, not to take anything from her but to offer support as she stood, a gesture that was small but monumental, the first time in 4 years that a man had reached for her with the intention of lifting her up rather than pulling her down. Sullivan's apology came out with his voice cracking slightly on the words. His brother had died fighting this system, fighting against everything the camps represented. He'd thought anger would honor his brother's memory somehow, would make the sacrifice mean something. But his brother would be ashamed of him right now. His brother would want him to help these women, not hurt them more than they'd already been hurt. Morrison opened the document in his hands, revealing not charges or condemnation, but Red Cross paperwork and repatriation forms. They'd located Ingrid's sons, he said gently. They were safe in American custody in Munich, healthy and asking about their mother every day. Ingrid's careful composure finally shattered completely. She wept not from pain or shame, but from the foreign sensation of hope fulfilled, of maternal love rewarded rather than punished, of prayers answered after years of silence. Liesel reached for her with shaking hands, and for the first time in days, her young face showed something other than terror, showed something that might have been cautious joy. Morrison continued speaking, explaining that they'd all be transferred to the repatriation center next week. But he wanted them to understand something before they went, something important. He looked at each of them in turn, his expression carrying the weight of absolute conviction, the certainty of someone who'd thought hard about what he wanted to say. He wanted them to tell people what they'd seen here at this camp. He wanted them to tell people that some of the Americans had remembered they were human when the world had forgotten, that not all soldiers were the same, that mercy still existed even in the aftermath of horror. Greta felt something shift inside her chest, not the cracking of breaking, but the settling of pieces finding their proper places after years of displacement. She'd been 19 when they stole her life, ripped it away from her with official papers and false promises. But she was 23 now, and 23 was old enough to choose what to do with whatever life remained ahead of her. Greta spoke, her voice growing stronger with each word as she found strength she'd forgotten she possessed. She would tell Morrison's families, she would tell everyone who would listen, that 3 German women would spend the rest of their lives proving that mercy was stronger than cruelty, that kindness could survive even the worst that humanity had to offer. Outside their window, the spring afternoon carried sounds of men preparing for peace rather than war, voices talking about home and futures instead of battles and death. For the first time since liberation arrived with its tanks and uncertainty, the future felt like something worth walking toward rather than simply enduring, something that held possibility instead of just more suffering. The 3 women stood together in Building 7, holding each other's hands, and allowed themselves to believe that tomorrow might actually be better than today, that healing might actually be possible, that they might actually deserve the mercy they'd been shown. The clean blankets no longer felt stolen. The medical care no longer felt like a debt they'd have to repay. The simple dignity of being asked for permission no longer felt like a cruel joke. These things felt like what they actually were, the first tentative steps toward becoming human again, toward reclaiming the lives that had been taken from them, toward understanding that surviving didn't make them guilty, it made them survivors, and that was something worth being, something worth fighting for, something worth living for in whatever days remained ahead.